If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel Nikoloff and Darnell Samuels.
Bro, we're touching on that topic again, but it's making me think back to March 2020? No, March of 2021, when I was like, actually, no, you're right. It was June of 2020, sorry, when I said, oh man, it's a good thing we've taken a break or we'd have way too many COVID episodes.
Right, yeah.
Because like, you know, when it first hit, like we didn't really touch this topic. And you know, now that the heat's been turning up, they're boiling the frogs. We're I think rightfully touching on this topic a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I think this one's timely. I think, you know, people kind of had at the back of their minds that the vaccine passport was going to come to the church. It was just a matter of when, so it's already come. Up to this point in this recording, I haven't, like research-wise, I haven't really found much information on it per se. So yeah, we're gonna definitely jump in with fresh eyes.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you know, I mean, just for make sure the listener for the listener to make sure they understand, the vaccine passports are a optional scenario for churches, and what that allows them to do is essentially, if they implement it, they can remove the capacity limitations that they currently are under.
Does it also include masks?
I mean, no. The mask, as far as I understand, the mask rules haven't changed.
Okay, and for the listeners, this episode came from a tweet from Jamil Jivani about 3 days ago, and that's how I stumbled across it, and he says this. Ontario's new rules will give places of worship the ability to opt in to vaccine passports. This will be tragically divisive in our communities and may turn believers against one another. A true shame. Protect your hearts, brothers and sisters. And then he attached the document, the policy document, to the tweet. So, you know, checked it out. And I was like, oh, wait, there's something here. There's a lot of layers to peel back in regards to what this will potentially look like once it eventually starts to play out. So the direction we'll go with this episode is we'll look at incentives matter. Vaccine passports make church easier. The second point would be love your neighbor. Consider others more important than yourself. And wealthism, racism, healthism.
So, but before we do jump into the topic, I think it's fitting to make reference to the fact that it's kind of there's a couple ironic components. Ironic might not be the right word. There's a couple interesting components to this safety plan, as we've been made aware of by the government, and that is, you know, we've had many of these plans over the last 2 years. And, you know, there's one consistent thing, and that is there are zero objective standards provided, right? Definitely left to be subjective. And if I'll put the link in the show notes page for sort of this 1-page graphic that I think summarizes the plan really well. And for winter 2021, 2022, when they're planning to sort of move away from some of these things, it says, in the absence of concerning trends. Do you think concerning trends is a objective criteria?
No, it doesn't sound like it.
But this is the point. If you go back, if people want to go and do the work and find them, I can't remember the March 2021 lockdown protocols that we've sort of just come out of for the summer of 2021. But spring 2020, we had a reopening plan of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And then December 2020, we had a color-coded lockdown, gray, red, yellow, green, something like that. That was like, protect, lock. And it was like, again, no, there was some objective criteria for case numbers, but it was really, there was an inability to hold those accountable with regards to objective criteria to determine that the measures they're putting in place are effective.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, but I guess for some people, that's still the idea. Yes, you're saying objective, but some people it's all relative. You're just going to go along with what's being said.
Objective may not be the right word. My point is that how do you judge something when you provide no benchmarks, right? Like, how do we know that vaccine passports are actually making a difference? Well, because obviously the government wouldn't do it without it. So we just have to assume that it's a better solution. And obviously things would be way worse if we weren't doing this. Sounds like a politician, right?
You know what? I hear you.
It could always be worse. It would have been worse had we not. And it's especially in a scenario where we're talking about, and I might have used this term on the show before, but we're not talking about a sterilizing vaccine. And that might sound a little, crazy of a term. But sterilizing vaccines are ones that prevent infection, not ones that minimize, let's say, severe outcomes, which the flu shot is sort of like that historically. But this vaccine, it's very clear. Vaccinated people can get the infection, they can spread the infection. And so because it's not a sterilizing vaccine, the vaccine passport doesn't prove or doesn't give any validation that this individual who's coming to your place that you're testing their vaccine certification is not infectious, is not sick, is not going to cause someone else to get a breakthrough infection.
Mm-hmm.
And we have no data to suggest, what type of a vaccinated person is more likely to get infected. Is it, some of the stuff, without getting into too much of the nuance, but, is it based on time frame? I mean, there's lots of talk, let's say in the mainstream news, about the need for boosters, which basically says that the vaccine wears off over time. There's a guy, I've mentioned him on the show before, his funny name, Norman Huchasm. And he talks about, it's Human Norchasm. That's why it's funny. Human.
Okay.
He's sort of speculating a lot of the breakthrough infections are because of vaccine failure. So because we're not testing after the fact to confirm that the vaccine has worked, his argument, and maybe right, might be wrong, is that it's actually a high rate of failure. He would also refer to early on with these mRNA vaccines, they had to keep them at like super cold temperatures as a way to preserve the contents, the mRNA. He would argue that maybe we've relaxed some of those policies and now the mRNA is being destroyed. And so you're actually injecting a vaccine that's not working because it's, gone spoiled. Again, I'm not trying to say which arguments are right or wrong. The point is we really don't have a good understanding of the cause and effect relationship between breakthrough infections. And so what does the vaccine passport confirm? Basically, you're obedient.
Yeah, well, I guess the some churches would disagree. Some pastors would disagree with you and argue the exact opposite, and that's why they would opt for vaccine passports for their church.
Well, I would say that they're going to argue this is what the public health officials suggest.
Yeah, yes, and check the science, and the science speaks for itself. He say, she say.
Well, and that's why I said it's unexplained as the cause and effect of breakthrough infections. That's more so my point. The health officials aren't giving us an explanation of breakthrough infections. We don't have a good reason as to what is the reason these are occurring. And because of that, my point is that the public health officials are still saying this is helpful, but we know breakthrough infections are happening. We know that vaccinated people can spread it. And so even if there's an argument that, let's say, that there's no data that fully can I prove this, and that's partly because of where we are, there's no data that says, oh, for sure that vaccinated people reduce spread by X percentage, 10%, 50%, 75%. We don't have those type of quantifiable numbers. And my point is that they can say in theory it should, But until you can start explaining the breakthrough infections and the cause and effect relationship, what you do know, the vaccine passport, all it does is say, yes, this person has been vaccinated. But does the vaccine work? Again, that's in the Human Norchasm argument that a lot of the breakthrough infections are because they didn't, the vaccine failure. And some of the other arguments that are happening is the idea of the effects waning. So the person who got right now, let's say someone who got the vaccine in February or March, are they still given protection, or has it waned and now they technically need a booster? Which, again, that's sort of what's coming down the pipe in terms of these passports. More than likely, after 6 months of your second shot, and guess what? You're no longer fully vaccinated. So, anyways, I know I've sort of gone on a rant there, but my point is that 100% all that we know is that, yes, this person's vaccinated. We don't necessarily know the level of protection they're actually providing, potentially, if any at all.
Yeah, and well, either way, whatever the vaccine passport provides in regards to making people feel safe is all that matters, right? In a sense, that's all that matters, that you're taking the proper precautions to make people feel safe.
Well, my argument would be, is that a false sense of safety?
Yeah, but that's your argument.
No, but this is based on the data, based on the fact that there are breakthrough infections. Like, are you creating a false sense of safety such that you're going to actually have more infections because people are not going to be as cautious? People are going to be less likely to wash their hands. They're going to be more likely to, have, let's call it, risky behavior. And more importantly, I would say for me, the perspective is with regards to high risk individuals, right? Like, my attitude is, if you're not high risk, largely the risks are not being represented properly. But for the high risk individual, right? So the church that goes, oh, we're fully vaccinated. Yeah, but the 75-year-old guy who cannot get COVID, are you more likely now to infect him because of the failures with regards to waning or failures or whatever the arguments are regarding breakthrough infections?
Yeah.
Does that false sense of safety actually counter affect the intended purpose?
Yeah, I think that remains to be seen. So until we see these things play out, then people can say, oh, Joel was right. But in the meantime, people are kind of waiting to see how this experiment unfolds. And so now we're looking at a situation where the church is kind of saying, okay, well, why are churches not doing it? Why aren't we involved? You can have vaccine passports at gyms, movies, but why not the church? And I think that's a valid question. A good question. Why we don't have it in the church? So even if churches take the stance that they should not implement vaccine mandates, so what is their primary motivation for not doing it? Is it because it produces unfavorable consequences, or that it is inherently immoral, right? And that's kind of like the ethical dilemma that a lot of churches will wrestle with into why. Like, if they do, they do. But if they don't, is it because they think it's immoral or unfavorable consequences? Like, it'll bring division.
Yeah, I think if we look at Paul Carter's article, I think he definitely seems to be leaning on the side that there's going to be a concern for unity, regardless of the side that you stand on, right? Like, hypothetically, if you've got someone who's exceptionally high risk, they're going to be like, well, I can't come back to church because not everybody's vaccinated. Now, I think that logic that the media, let's call it the pandemic of the unvaccinated, and that the unvaccinated spread the virus more, that's also a claim that's not substantiated, but definitely perpetuated by the media. And when I say unsubstantiated, really what I'm saying is, like, if we look at case numbers in places like Israel that were vaccinated first, the number of cases is the same so if 95% of the population is vaccinated, 95% of the cases are in the vaccinated. So that's more my point in terms of unsubstantiated. And so if you've got someone who's saying, I can't come because you have unvaccinated people there, the dilemma is whether they're right or wrong is irrelevant. They're going to feel like, well, the church should be putting in this rule because otherwise I can't come to church.
Right.
And then flip that around. Obviously, for the vaccinated or unvaccinated, if you put in the passport, well, now they can't come to church.
Right.
And so regardless, there's a potential for unity issues.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's why churches they'll be tempted to be partial to the unvaccinated in order to grant capacity.
You mean to the, yeah. Because now it becomes a numbers game, which is, I would say it's understandable, but also an aspect of compromise, right? Like, if you think about it just purely like, again, the accounting mind in me, like cost accounting or cost, revenue drivers concepts. Well, the number of butts in the seats will directly impact the amount of donations. Therefore, if we can have more butts in our seats, we'll be more profitable and we can sustain ourselves better. Hence, we need a vaccine passport.
Yeah. And I think, well, the heart of the issue that those churches that are opting for vaccine passports, based on the National Post article where they interviewed a couple pastors who were for it, put in the show notes, and generally they were all kind of saying the same thing, right? So the idea of proof of vaccination would have made things easier for his congregation, or the certificate would bring peace of mind to people. And then another pastor said, I don't think the government went far enough, and I definitely think they should have mandated religious organizations, right? It definitely would have made our lives easier. So the idea is that
they wouldn't be held accountable because they don't have to make the decision. Like when he said it would have made our lives easier by mandating it.
Yeah. Right. And part of it too is, like I'm sure, those pastors might have said, okay, well, actually we agree with vaccine passports and getting them. They might be pro-vax. And so part of that support is saying, okay, well, the state also approves it. So you have no grounds to disagree. And then it's just a clean cut break where you're like, okay, well, they're willing to make that separation between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated in their congregation.
Well, and I would argue they can, if the government mandates it, they don't have to worry about forcing their congregants to go against their conscience.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like we've already on the show multiple times, there is a rational, whether you agree with it or not, there's a rational argument to be made regarding abortion and being against the use of vaccines. Now, you can argue against it, you can argue for it. That's not the point. But if you have a congregant member who's like, I don't feel comfortable because they use because of the relationship with abortion, how do you as a pastor go, well, I don't care? You can't. Like you can't. You're literally you're going against scripture to be like, no, you have to get vaccinated.
On the grounds of the fetal.
Well, on the grounds
cells?
that they have a conviction and you're asking them to go against that conviction. Right? And my point is that there's a strong biblical argument. There's one. Not to we were on our, on the previous show when we were talking about convictions versus opinion, there could be reasons that they are rationally concerned. Now, you might disagree with them. You might tell them that they're wrong. You might say, oh, you're trusting the quacko doctor. You shouldn't listen to Byram Bridle because somebody created a website showing you how bad he is. Whatever the reason, right? Like the point is though that they have, if your congregant member actually has a strong conviction to not do something, and you're now telling them to go against it, and arguably by putting the vaccine passport into your church, you're coercing them to go against it. And the reason I would use the word coercion, I think both you and I would agree, telling your congregant member to participate via Zoom is not church. Right? Like, granted, someone's laid up in bed. Obviously, Zoom is like the only option they have. But as a church, what would we also do? We'd send people to their house to minister to them. We send our congregation to go to their house, and the person who can't come to the church, we go to them, right? Like part of community of being in a church is so much about being in community, like in person. And so for me, it's like, okay, you're coercing them to go against their conscience, potentially, if you put this in place. But if the government does it, well, your hands are clean.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. What I would say to that is that, like, yes, so the government mandates it, but I would make the argument that a biblical view of church discipline goes against the vaccine passport. And a listener of ours, Jermaine Wall, said to me, shout out to Jermaine, and he's a church planter, and he said, like, in light of COVID and all this stuff happening, it's really revealed the DNA or the character of a lot of these local churches, and you really see what they're about, whether they were about fellowship or they were just, and I like this phrase he used, content providers. In the sense that, okay, well, just do YouTube, right? Like, subscribe, share, leave a comment, versus like, being in person.
Yeah, they were giving you a biblical curriculum, not being a church.
Yeah. And I was just like, yeah, it's a very subtle point. He wasn't necessarily slamming anybody, but it was a very subtle point that, yeah, like you definitely see you see the hand of a lot of churches in the way they played their cards in light of COVID, where you really see what your church is about and what your cousin's church is about, which is good because it's forcing these conversations believers need to have about ecclesiology, which prior to this whole thing, I've always made the argument that Christians have weak ecclesiology, and because they have a weak ecclesiology, you're all over the place. Whether it's in relation to how you deal with the world or you deal with yourself. And so the idea of the argument I'm making here is that church membership is like, it's a two-sided coin. So on one side you have membership, and on the other side you have church discipline, right? And so for some people are kind of saying, okay, well, what do you mean church discipline? And I mean, like, or church membership. I mean, just because you attend a church doesn't mean you're a member there. Right? And just like being a part of any membership, what comes with that is benefits, right? Benefits and regulations, right, that come with being a member. And so people are saying, okay, well, where do we see this in the Bible? Because a lot of people probably listening right now, they'd be like, wait a minute, like, I've been attending this church for 10 years and I've never become a member. But you assume you're a member, but you're not a member. But we see that, right? So we see the discipline, the case for discipline in 1 Corinthians 5, which assumes public knowledge of who's in the church and who's not. And then in verse 12 and 13, we see the expelling, right? So expelling makes sense only in the context of visible belonging. And then we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 6, the majority, when he uses the word majority, makes sense only in the context of a recognized whole. And then we know that lists of widows were kept in the New Testament church, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 9. And the Lord himself keeps a list of all members who will inherit eternal life, Revelation chapter 21, verse 27. And so I'm looking at the book, The Deliberate Church, Building Your Ministry on the Gospel by Mark Dever and Paul Alexander. And it says this: church membership then is a means by which we demarcate the boundaries of the church. This is logically implied by the negative sanctification or corrective church discipline. Corrective discipline assumes that it is important for a person himself to know that he is a member of the church. He can't be expected to submit to the church's discipline if he is unaware of his own membership in the church, right? So it also assumes that other members need to know whether or not a person is part of that church, right? So the idea is that the further corrective discipline assumes that it is important for those outside of the church to know who the members of the church are, because one of the main motives for corrective discipline is the corporate testimony of the church in the unbelieving community, right? right? So the idea is that church membership, the church examines you to give you a means of assurance. So that's why membership is important. Means of assurance, discipleship, and the regular gathering, right? Don't forsake the gathering, right?
Yeah,
Don't
and
forsake
that's
the
sort of what I
gathering.
was referring to before.
Yeah, and it's implied that it's not a Telegram group or a WhatsApp group, or it's an
Those are
actual
supplemental, not
yes,
the content.
but in the context of this, is actually meeting in person. So the idea is who does and who does not belong to the church. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1, where we see the guy getting kicked out of the church for sleeping with his dad's wife, his stepmom, right? And they're proud about it. And then so Paul's saying, okay, kick this guy out of the church. If he's getting kicked out, it's assuming he was a member. And then in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 5, he's saying, okay, bring this guy back in. Right? We also see the idea of the duty to assemble in Romans chapter 12, verse 3 to 18, and to serve. And so the idea is that if you put the vaccine passport in place, what it does is that it violates the person's biblical membership rights to be able to gather. So now you're actually sinning against the people you're supposed to be shepherding by violating their membership rights, because as a member, they have a right to gather.
That's good.
And now you're telling them, well, based on your health, not even your spiritual health. We can make the argument, hey Joel, don't come to church, because of your spiritual health, bro. You're disgusting. You're being divisive. You're being divisive. You're sowing seeds of dissension. You're preaching heresy. So you cannot. We have a spiritual passport. Right? To keep a heretical passport, a doctrinal passport to keep you out. But that's not what we're arguing. We're arguing, well, based on
and
your health.
Those wouldn't be members anymore.
What do you mean?
Right? Like the people that you keep out spiritually are the ones that you've generally removed from membership.
Well, yes. Well, there's layers to the discipline and how you remove people.
But the point is, spiritually, you're disciplining them because of their spiritual behavior.
Yes, but
on
of course,
non-spiritual reasons.
Yeah. So the idea is that with church discipline, again, and it's an act of love for people who are listening. They're like, oh man, see, that's why I hate the church, because these guys, all they want to do is come down on you, and you think it's one of those things where your mom's coming down on you or your dad's batting you up. That's not church discipline. Again, church discipline ties into the membership in regards to having somebody give you assurance. The believers, your brothers and sisters, give you assurance that you're actually saved. So the idea of church discipline is it's all about teaching, right? And that there's layers to it where that your
what does the discipline of exclusion for not getting your vaccine teach you?
So
teaches you to obey the state.
Yeah, well, there's 5 layers to it. So real quick, formative discipline, hear the word and fellowship, prayer meeting, ordinary means of grace. So the formative discipline is that the very fact that you're in prayer meeting, the Lord will speak to you about your sin. You're hanging out with brothers in the Lord, and they'll speak to you about your sin. You'll be sitting in service, and the pastor has a word for you, and it speaks to you about your sin. So that's the formative. And then there's a confrontational, Galatians 6, where you would confront somebody like Paul confronted Peter. And then we see in exclusion, Matthew 18, where 2 or more are gathered. They confront you, and you get excluded because you're not repenting from your sins. And then there's the disassociation, 1 Corinthians 5, again. And the disassociation has to do with somebody who isn't just repentant, but they're actually preaching heresy. And at that point, you can't treat them like an unbeliever. You have to just disassociate with them because they're too dangerous to
a wolf in
be
sheep's
around.
clothing.
So you kind of have to disassociate with them. And then the other one is restorative and bringing people to repentance. So again, I think that churches that practice to summarize what I'm saying, churches that practice vaccine passports are actually doing something unbiblical and actually hurting the sheep they're trying to protect.
Mm-hmm. Well, and now, if we want to think about the criticisms to that point, right? Like, we can use the article from this United Church in Toronto. It was dated September 2nd. The title of the article from the Toronto Star was, "I don't understand how a place of worship is any less important. Religious leaders asked to be included in Ontario's vaccine certificate." And so, he's trying to make whether it's the guy or a combination of the pastor and the author of the article, trying to make the case, well, I want to protect the congregants physically, and is that isn't protecting them from getting sick part of my responsibility? And I think we would both probably say, well, there's a biblical principle for that already: quarantine the sick. Not, and you sort of almost said this, but there's culturally, society, I don't know what the right, there's this perspective like unvaccinated equals unhealthy. And I think that's a very destructive perspective, because I'll say someone like me, I made a comment on Twitter a while ago now. Pharmacology is my last resort, not my first. And so, if I don't use pharmacology or pharmacy products unless I'm in a necessity, and the simplest example, obviously I'm going into surgery, I'm going to take the anesthetic to put me under. But when it comes to long-term care, pharmacology is almost off the table for me. So with that perspective, and there's plenty of people that are along the spectrum with regards to that. We've now sort of said, well, if you don't take this pharmacology product, you're deemed unhealthy.
Right. But the idea is that in the article from the pastor in Calgary, who was pro-vax,
that's should churches require vaccine passports? It's in Calgary Herald, and the author is also the pastor, I think, John Van Sloten. Yeah. So sorry, what was he?
Yeah. So in the article, he says, either way, we make a choice. So our little faith community has decided to side with the majority of civic-minded, science-trusting Calgarians for practical and theological reasons. Theologically, the argument is stronger. To be a Christian is to model one's life after Christ Jesus. Always put others first. He gave up his individual rights for the common good and sacrificed for the sake of the weak. He loved others as he loved himself, and would have surely done anything to best protect the unvaccinated children in his neighborhood. A Christian ethic always puts the vulnerable first. Take that, Joel.
Are my vulnerable children my first priority?
Well, he's making an argument that the Christians.
Yeah, no, the Christian, me, if I'm not putting my, so when I was on the
Anarchist,
the Anarchist Bible Study podcast, trying to see if I can find my notes. Darn it. There's a passage where, in the NASB, it says, don't, not merely looking after your own interests, but looking after the interests of others. And merely is such a key word, because we're not just going to throw out our own needs, right? Like, your needs still matter, but we are looking to the needs of others first. Well, as a church member, is another person in my church the primary means that I look out for others, or as a parent, do my children become, or as a husband, is my wife's needs the first priority? Do I sacrifice my wife's needs for this person in my church? Right? Like, what if there's competing needs? Right? Like, my point is that this statement is like an oversimplification. Well, obviously, you just do what is best for the community without actually making the argument that this is best for the community. Right. Again, that's why when we started this conversation, I mentioned the concept of a sterilizing vaccine. Now, I would argue, even in the case of a sterilizing vaccine, this is sort of stupid or a violation of rights. It's a example of ignoring the rights of another. It's compulsory as opposed to, I know this isn't a great theological point, but the biblical, New Testament talks about being a cheerful giver. Now, it's normally talking about towards the church and donating to and supporting the church. But in general, the principle there is that this is a voluntary act that you're doing to serve one another. And so let's just throw that away, right? Like, we're just going to do it compulsory as opposed to potentially call you to serve somebody. And if you decide that this particular action is not for you, I respect it, right? There's no command to say, this is the exact way that you serve your neighbor, right? I am going to look out for the needs of my neighbor. So in my church, for example, if there is a high risk individual, maybe I avoid that person. Maybe I make sure not to come in close quarters with that person, right? Like there may be other means that I can serve them, but there's an oversimplification that, obviously this is the way that you do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting. And I guess part of it too is like looking at the passage of, first of all, I think the way this guy talks about Jesus dealing with the unvaccinated children in his neighborhood, I think it assumes. I think he's making an inference that isn't necessarily there in Scripture.
And I would argue it's not supported by the science either.
Okay. Well, I'm saying that.
But anyways,
we have to be careful. We have to be careful to assuming things that Jesus would have done that the Scriptures don't necessarily address. Right. So the idea is people will say, what would Jesus do? I don't believe in that. I don't think that's biblical to say what would Jesus do, and we go do what Jesus do. I don't think everything Jesus did is something we should do.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's
the body has multiple parts.
Well, no. I know that's not quite the point you're making. I know. I was just gonna say that that we shouldn't do what Jesus did. We should do what Jesus said. So the idea is we build God's will of command, not his will of decree, right? Will of command, will of decree. And so he commands us to, love the poor, take care of widows, don't steal, don't lie.
Mm-hmm.
But his will of decree is one of those things where we see things happening. Like, for example, Jesus flipped over tables. Because he didn't like what was going on. Like, I'm not going to go into somebody's church that's preaching false teaching and flip it over. I'm not going to do that. Jesus says in the passage,
and context is relevant, right? Like, I think some of what your point is too is that like doing what Jesus did is more important to understand the theology that's underlying via what he said and apply that to the context.
Yeah, right. And so the point is, and I think the reason, so Jesus does these, I'm not going to say weird things because that sounds weird, but Jesus does these things that show that he's God and he's separate and he's different, as we say in the streets. Jesus is different. He's just different. So, for example, Matthew 15:26, and he says to the woman who's a Gentile and she's asking for help. And Jesus says, it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Well, that's not nice.
Mm-hmm.
That's not nice to say to somebody who's in need and refer to them by the racial slur, in a sense, because
Mm-hmm.
Gentiles were seen as dogs. Like do it, Jesus. Yeah, we're not going to do that. Jesus is feeding the 5,000. Right? I mean, this is one of my favorite passages. Jesus is feeding the 5,000, and then he gets jumped, and then they try to jump him. Well, why did they try to jump him? Well, because they wanted to make him king. Well, why they wanted to make him king? Well, because he's giving them free food. And why not have a king where you can have a free welfare, have a welfare state, a universal welfare state that doesn't dry up? So they got aggressive with him.
The only person in human history who didn't have to worry about scarcity of resources.
Right. But what Jesus does is, right, he had to flee, he had to disappear because he had another agenda. Now Jesus could have just sat there and said, okay, you know what? Yeah, let's establish this a kingdom. Let's get rid of these Romans. Let's get rid of this oppression. Let's have free food for everybody and call it a day. And so my point is that, him using Jesus as a Gandhi is not biblical. And so I think it's important to, when we talk about Jesus, to make sure that there's balance to Jesus, right? There's balance to Jesus in the way he went about his life, where he isn't leaning on a political spectrum.
So I think there's a paragraph that this guy wrote that I think is, so that pastor from the articles in Calgary Herald, there'd be a show notes page, but the article or that paragraph that you're referring to, this is what he wrote. And I actually, this morning in my readings, I was coming across a verse that actually made me stop and go, okay, no, I don't have enough time. I got to do this tomorrow because I really want to dig into this. But so I'll read it after. So the paragraph is and this is what you said, theologically, the argument is stronger. And you started to read this, but I think the whole paragraph is really helpful. So to be a Christian is to model one's life after Christ. Jesus always put others first. He gave up his individual rights for the common good and sacrificed for the sake of the weak. He loved others as he loved himself. And he would have surely done anything to best protect the unvaccinated children in his neighborhood. A Christian ethic always puts the vulnerable first. So this morning, Proverbs 29, verse 7. The righteous is concerned for the rights of the poor. The wicked does not understand such concern. And so the reason I stopped was, wait a second, how often do I see the word rights in text or in the biblical text? My first instinct was like, whoa, this is like the first time I've seen this. And so I paused because I was like, okay, I gotta dig. I gotta look up some commentaries. I gotta look up other translations. I want to really, and again, I'm reading from NASB. And so the reason why I think it's so important here is like, one, his statement, Jesus, he gave up his individual rights for the common good and sacrificed for the sake of the weak. Is he talking about Jesus going to the cross?
What do you mean?
Like when he's saying that Jesus gave up his individual rights, is he talking about God going to the cross? Or Jesus going to the cross, God going to the cross?
I think so.
Now, I know there is text that talks about there is no greater love than the one who lays down his life for his brother. Mm-hmm. But who qualifies as my brother?
Sorry, what's your point? What are you getting at? And with the brothers, those who follow God's word. Yeah. What's your point?
But I mean, I'm thinking about like in my community of a church, right? And, the example that I would say for those of us that go to bigger churches, as you move outside of, let's call it your small group, what that looks like is going to change significantly, right? Like what I mean by that is like, if I go to a church with 4,000 people and, somebody that I don't really know has a particular need, the level that I sacrifice for them is going to be different than the people that I live in community with through my small group. And I think I use the number 4,000 because clearly there's going to be people within your church that you just like don't know. And so the way that I sacrifice and I serve them might be monetarily, as opposed to I'm willing to get on an operating table and give them my kidney. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying that maybe more people should be willing to get on an operating table and give them a kidney, but to some extent, I'm like, okay, as a young father, I'm going to be potentially taking a risk. Maybe it's a small risk, but maybe it's not a risk I'm comfortable taking, because ultimately I feel like I need to lay down my life for my kids and my wife first. And if I'm potentially hindering that, is this really what God's calling me to do? and again, that's why I go back to like, it's like, to me, it's an oversimplification of this principle, because I would argue either he has an agenda or he's trying to make an argument, as opposed to like, he's not teasing out what does laying down your life look like in the context of a church where you've got, let's just make up some 25% unvaccinated and 75% vaccinated. What does laying down your life look like in that context? That's not the question he's asking. He's writing an article to justify the position he already has.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so the idea, I guess, that I think he's getting at, and or maybe I don't want to assume too much into him and misrepresent the man, so I'm not going to misrepresent him. But the idea that I think that a lot of people kind of get at is the idea of healthism, right? And so whenever we add a suffix, an ism to the end of a word, we philosophize it. Racism, capitalism, socialism. When we add the ism to the end of the word, it becomes more of a philosophy. So when we say healthism, the idea is that, you know, people have their own philosophy on health, right? That's why, you know, people say, I'll get a second opinion. This is why we have naturopaths, and then traditional big pharma, right? So people kind of forget the idea that people actually have their own philosophies on medicine. And it's rarely ever talked about. So people assume like it's already a foregone conclusion that this particular doctor knows everything, right? So you have the idea of healthism. We've seen wealthism, and even like, so these are ideas. So wealthism is an idea where especially in the context of a church, where we're like, okay, well, we're going to prioritize those who are most wealthy. And so we're going to keep those poor people out, and we're going to lift up those who are of noble status. This is what we saw in the 16th century in Germany, and this is what sparks the Protestant Reformation, and in France and Switzerland, right? And
this is what's in Galatians. No, James 2, right?
Yeah.
James 2, right?
Partiality
to the rich, because you wanted them to be donating to your church.
Right. So we see the wealthism in the church, and that being a divisive point. We also see racism. We see racism as a point of division in the church, where we said, okay, you know, no blacks. Right. And so now we see healthism in a sense where we see a medical apartheid in the church. And so the idea is this: if churches today are so quick to implement vaccine mandates, how quick would they have been to implement segregation laws in the 60s when black and white churches were segregated? Right. So would we as a church been just as complicit to church segregation back then? And as a historian, you know, a lot of times we presentize the past, and we try to say, or like chronological snobbery. I love that term, right? Where we look back and we're like, we're better than those guys, which is missing the whole point, because
those guys are just like us.
Yeah, they're just like us, and especially if you're not working from a Christocentric worldview, where you're working with a higher authority of moral status. So if you don't work with that worldview, what argument do you make for what is a moral standard? Because back then, when black people were being enslaved, the moral standard was what the majority thought, right? Just like today, but it's just like today. Like you say, okay, well, what's the moral standard for what's right or wrong? Well, it's what the majority thought. So if our moral standard today is based on what the majority thought, back then it was the same thing. So what makes you think you're different than those in the past?
Yeah, I was actually. It's good you said that way, because I wanted to make sure I understood the parallel you were drawing, because I think it's easy for people to like, what are you talking about? Like, you know, racial segregation and vaccine segregation. How are those the same?
Oh well,
but
you want to know how those are the same? Both liberties are being violated. Both liberties are being violated, right? Same thing when women were being mistreated,
Mhm.
right? The idea isn't, well, okay, well, it's because it's women or because they're black or because they haven't been vaccinated. No, what the thing that the common ground that all these marginalized, even the Jews, the thing that all these marginalized people had was liberty. It was limited,
It was a
right?
limitation of their liberty.
It was a limitation of their liberty, right? So this is
Or
the
more
heart.
so, I would say limitation of their rights.
Yes.
But-
Okay. Yes. Okay. Yes. That's fine. But this is a problem.
Yes.
And this is the connection that people fail. This is the connection people are failing to make. And so just like, when we look at these churches and they say, okay, yeah, let's just implement a vaccine passport, right? To segregate our congregation, the elect and the non-elect. And actually, I could be wrong, but I guarantee most of those churches that actually believe in the elect and non-elect wouldn't be doing that. But anyways, that's a whole nother episode. But yeah, but the whole idea is like, yeah, okay, those people who are vaccinated are the elect, and those who are not are reprobates. So we got to put them out, right? But even we know that basic ecclesiologies, the church still welcomes goats, right, just as well as sheep, right?
But no wolves.
What?
I said, but no wolves.
Yeah, well, the idea and the idea of wealthism, I read it in an article from R. Reno, in the magazine First Things, and he's he was a professor of theology at Creighton, and so now he started this magazine, and he says this in it, and this is about wealthism because people are like, oh, what do you mean wealthism? And so forth. So he says this: we are rightly vigilant in our fight against wealthism. We should be equally vigilant resisting healthism. The lure of lucre has been around for a long time. More recent is a close relative of greed. What some call safetyism and what I'm calling healthism, it is the disordered pursuit of health, one that overvalues physical well-being. Healthism is evident in our society. Exercise is a good thing, but most of us know someone for whom the many hours at the gym feed vanity about her figure or fend off his fears of aging. Or we know someone who suffers from painful, even paralyzing anxieties about getting sick that are out of proportion of any sick or any risk or danger. And when he said that, I thought to myself, I'm like, yeah, germaphobes, right? we all know germaphobes.
Howie Mandel.
But we all know germaphobes. God bless them. But right, like it's good to be clean. It's good to wash your hands. It's good to, I don't like a nasty place, right? So be clean. I'm all for that. But then there's a point where they take it too far. Where it'll prevent them from doing certain things. And for some people, no word of a lie, it prevents them from going to church. Right? And COVID has heightened this germophobism or healthism. I think it's heightened it to the point where people are like now, like, you know what? I can't even breathe. And I heard the term before, and it kind of scared me. I can't even breathe unvaccinated air. Right. And if those things are preventing you from doing your biblical call to be a member and committing to serve a community, then you're practicing idolatry and you're in sin.
I think that's a really good point. I think with regards to idolatry, there's, I think, a lot of fear right now, which to some extent is understandable, but disproportionate. And consequently, there's this, idolatry of looking to the health experts to solve my fear. I just want to go back to normal. I just want whatever. But it's a failure to, in the case of the scenario we're talking about, okay, what is God calling me to serve my membership, which includes unvaccinated people? And I think, to circle back around, one of the dilemmas that you have to wrestle with is,
sorry. Just I also wanted to hit the point that the church during the Black Plague was on the front lines serving people. So we can't sit here and say, okay, well the church hid in safety and didn't deal with people who were sick. But anyway, sorry, Joel, go ahead.
Well, and it's a great point. Like, okay, if you're afraid and you think the vaccine works, what are you afraid of? Like, if you're actually afraid of unvaccinated air, that tells me you don't think the vaccine works, right? Like, it's sort of like talking outside of both sides of your mouth, right? Like, if the vaccine works, that's why you want me to get it. Okay. But if you have a problem being around somebody who's unvaccinated, that means you don't think it works. Because and so this is where it's like the fear is disproportionate. Because go back to the reason why I wanted to mention that was like, if you're wanting to serve other people, you went and got the vaccine so you could now go into the community and serve on the front lines. Well, you're actually undermining that perspective by saying, well, I can't be around unvaccinated people.
Okay. Well, let me ask. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that, the idolatry piece is it's this very peculiar thing that I think is a product of a lot, right? It's a product of, let's say, Canadians growing up in this very socialized system that we didn't realize how socialized it was. It's the education system that is like super subversive regarding, free market perspectives. We always need central planning. There's always got to be somebody deciding for everybody because people are way too stupid, or, people are just not going to follow the rules and it's going to put other people at risk. So we need some of these central planners this is a Marxist ideology that is rampant in our school systems. It's rampant in, higher education. I was blessed to some extent because I was in a more, numbers objective, classes that I really didn't get exposure to it. But it's this ideology that is saying, I need someone to help. I need someone to do it for me. And now there's an idea, and you mentioned it earlier about, I sort of said, okay, rights, but I think liberty is a really good word. Like, both of those words are important to use because you have the liberty to stay home if you're afraid, but you want to restrict someone else's liberty so that you don't feel afraid, right? You want to restrict the liberty of another, the unvaccinated, so that you can do something that you currently have the liberty not to do, and you're choosing not to do because you're afraid. Now,
right.
There may be let's take the high risk scenario person, right? There may be a reason that you may not be able to go to a large group of people during a pandemic. But what's the right call for if I want to respect rights, I want to respect liberties? Is it to say, okay, I'm going to restrict other people's liberties so that I'm safe? Or is it to say, I either choose the risk or I choose not to take the risk? And I would argue, as a Christian, if you're saved, what are you afraid of? Go live in community with your church and trust God. Now, don't be reckless. Take precautions. Wash your hands.
What's your 2 cents on the issue?
My 2 cents is that if your church is putting this in place, I really think you need to consider another church. I wouldn't say that universally. There's no exceptions, but I would be very skeptical of the decisions. I want to leave a little bit of room for grace for, let's say a long-term care facility church. I can disagree, but I can be a lot more understanding because potentially there are no unvaccinated people as the membership. So if your membership is fully vaccinated, the primary ecclesiology is shepherding the flock and not evangelism, right? That's the Great Commission is not the role of the church, right? That's the role of the individual.
Mhm.
So if you have a church that's fully vaccinated, putting in the mandate basically just keeps out the riffraff, if you want to look at it that way. And I'm a little bit more, let's call it, sympathetic to that. But as soon as you have membership, or let's call them regular congregants, because our membership theology is pretty soft. Regular congregants who are unvaccinated, and you decide that it's appropriate to exclude them. Yeah, I think you probably need to leave your church and look for a church that's biblically sound. What about you? What's your 2 cents?
I think that if you could, I'm going to try to give it like a somewhat of a balanced approach in regards to looking at this. So, for example, we have Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14, and it talks about, it says this: since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself, talking about Jesus, likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil. And so for Christians, we the way we look at death, yes, nobody wants to die, but I think there has to be a distinction with Christians in the way we look at death, and that we're not overly we're not lifting it up as the primary virtue par excellence, right? And that we understand that we're not in fear of hope because of what Christ has done on the cross for us. But with that said, we look at, I would also, on the flip side, I'd put Matthew 4:7, and that the scriptures, Jesus says in Matthew 4:7, Jesus says to Satan, when he tells him to jump off a cliff and the Lord will catch you, he says, again, it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test or tempt God. So I've heard people say, and I just want to make it clear that, we're not saying, okay, don't get vaccinated. Because people who get vaccinated don't trust God, or God will come in and save you. Trust God, so don't get vaccinated. That's not what I'm saying. That I think there's balance to not being afraid of death, but also being responsible. And that goes back to my earlier point that Jesus is very nonpartisan, and Jesus. When you look at Jesus's life, he's very unpredictable. He's very unpredictable, and he doesn't fall within anybody's box. And I think this is how you know he is divine, because he doesn't necessarily align with anybody. So we have to kind of be careful to make Jesus a Jesus of our mind and not a Jesus of Scripture. So I'll conclude with this. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has been good for the church historically, right? So the church is historically the church has flourished in the midst of persecution and hardship. And the pandemic has given the church an opportunity to tighten its ship doctrinally. So if the vaccine passport is the paradigm of love, then the church vaccine passports are the right thing to do. Now, I would humbly disagree. The mandate of the church is not to preserve lives, but to save lives through the body of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Let us know what you guys think. Were we off on anything? Did we miss anything? Is your church thinking about implementing vaccine passports?
And you need a recommendation for a new church.
You need a recommendation. Yeah, no,
I couldn't resist.
Yeah, no. We'll definitely get to see how this plays out. But I hope this was helpful for a lot of people who probably going to their church and being like, okay, hold on, what the heck? What is this? So please let us know what you guys think. You can contact us at sixthsensereport@gmail.com. Like us on Facebook. Leave a comment, review on whatever podcast catcher you are listening to. It really helps the show to grow. If you're trying to get in touch with me, it's Darnell, DOGUDDA_Darnell on Twitter and Instagram, or Darnell Samuels on Facebook.
And I'm TJoelN39 everywhere. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. And yeah, just let us know what if there's another dimension to this issue. We definitely we don't want to miss it, because
We'll probably come back to it another time.
yeah,
I'm sure. I'm sure it'll come back up again.
Well, and I mean, if history in the last year and a half serves us, we will see that these measures likely aren't going away. They might pull back a little, but there's definitely some. I know this protocol. We've only really touched on the part about vaccine passports in the church. There's a couple more pieces that this legislation. Well, it's not even. It's an order in council, which is a whole nother dilemma. But there's meat here, so it's likely going to be coming up in conversation again, especially if when Ontario goes into an election next summer. So, yeah, as I said, if there's something else that whether it's vaccine passports in the church or with this particular rules and mandates that have come into place that you want us to speak on, definitely reach out, because as we've said, there's plenty of times listeners have given us the reason or the catalyst to have a conversation that maybe we weren't expecting.
Yeah, and make sure you guys go join a church, man. If you're a believer and you out here attending what is it, Common Grace Pillow Fellowship, you need to leave that church. Right? And find a place of sound, loving believers. Make a commitment. You grown now.
Get in community.
Make a commitment to serve and love some people, man, and stop attending Common Grace Pillow Fellowship.
6 cents makes change.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?
Madden and Mitchell Media.